Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today is the fourth video and the final video, at least for this first read through of Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities. Again, like I addressed in the first three videos, I'm reading this in conjunction with a reading group that's going on Twitter or Book Twitter. I'll put all the details below. It's a wonderful group and you can use the hashtag Musil2020 and follow the conversation. There's also a resident scholar, Genese, whose commentary on both Twitter and on her supplementary blog spot, Musil Attempts, is sublime. I've been copying and pasting each of the entries on her blog into a running Word document so that I can print it out. It's up to something like 27 pages. I cannot even express the level of scholarship that Genese presents for Musil and The Man Without Qualities in these blog posts. They are far beyond anything that I could possibly capture. I have not been studying Musil and I do not have the acumen that Genese so obviously has. So I highly recommend that I also put her blog spot down below. But again, this is the fourth video. The previous video, we were in volume 2 of the Knopf hardcover, and we addressed the first 200 pages of the Posthumous papers, ending with those 4 alternate draft versions that were mostly about ruminations on love, and especially this very interesting flavor of love between Ulrich and his Siamese twin, Agatha. So now what this video will focus on is basically the entire rest of what we have here, which is pages 1335 through the end, 1774, which that includes, of course, the translators afterward. I'm probably not going to touch on anything in there, those couple of pages, though Burton Pike does talk about the aesthetics with the German language that Musil was using, and some of the philological elements therein that unfortunately I can't speak to in this English translation, but it's interesting to hear how Pike brought that through. It's always, translation is also a work of art. It is a craft, and people who do it well are craftsmen and craftswomen. I can't help but marvel at like John E. Woods actually translating Bottom's Dream. I haven't read that, but it's just remarkable to think how in the world they could transpose that. And I agree with Douglas Hofstadter, as he points out relentlessly in his book Le Tombeau de Marot, which I've talked about a lot on this channel, in praise of the music of language is its subtitle. It's about 800 pages, all about translation. And I cannot agree more with the fact that the translators of these books really should have just as much of a presence. I mean, even on the book jackets and so on, their names should be prominent with the author, because you're really getting 2 works of art in one. So anyway, I try to in my table of contents, I try to put little notes about what each of these chapters entails, because sometimes a chapter title that says Night Talk or Early Morning Walk or Walter and Clarissa's Woodsy Armistice doesn't tell me exactly what happened, and there's just so much that goes on in here. I need to put little keys. Anyway, we're going to, this video focuses on the scope of the alternate draft versions, 1940 to 1942. These are 4 chapters that are all about Ulrich and Agatha and love, and in love. Then the further sketches, it's about 3 chapters. It's mainly about the concept of genius, and we get General Stumm's thoughts, but also Ulrich and Agatha. Then the sketches for a continuation of the gallery chapters, and these are comprised of Ulrich and Agatha and morality. And then Clarissa and her further conceptions of sin and double beings. And then Ulrich and Agatha again on the concept of the inner sister, and then simile and representation. And then there's this section of Ulrich and then Ulrich and Agatha, and then Agatha, and these are interesting because we get Ulrich attempting to help Musbrugger escape. We get Ulrich and Agatha traveling together, and these are some of the most sublime prose poems in the whole work. And then we get a chapter on Caconia, and it's Musil attempting to locate the crucible of the World War. So that's the most explicit of everything in here, besides his notes about the novel in the very back, explicitly about this pivotal year, 1913, leading into the outbreak of the Great War. Then we get the pinnacle, in my opinion, the pinnacle of this entire work. And this is all the sections included under the heading Clarissa, Walter, and Ulrich. And we're going to spend time in there mostly in this video. This is when, in these sections, this is about page 1537 to 1644. This was when it was completely conclusive for me that the posthumous papers are absolutely the greatest part of this project, The Man Without Qualities. Now, I still think that you need, the novel, the published novel, the novel proper, to get that context for the writing and some of the major ideas and the characters and so on. But this posthumous work is incredible. We see Musil, the philosopher, the empiricist, psychologist, and the novelist, all together operating and firing on all cylinders. Then there's a section, Fischl, Goethe, Hansepp, and Ulrich, and then the Rachel section, which follows the section of Clarissa, Walter, and Ulrich for its level of the sublime. This is where Clarissa has helped Musbrugger escape, and she talks Rachel into hiding Musbrugger in her house, in Rachel's house with him, and there's a lot more to that, but this is an incredible section. Then there are some narrative drafts, and then sketches and notes about the novel. But first, let me step back and talk for just a second about a book that Genese Grill brought to our attention. It's called The Vanishing Subject. It's by Judith Ryan. Now, and it's early psychology and literary modernism. Genese mentioned this on Twitter, and I went out there and couldn't find really an affordable copy, but then the more she plugged it, and then what little I started looking into, I realized that this is a major tool in any kind of approach to The Man Without Qualities and Musil, and not just some one-off pigeonholed literary criticism. Reading through this, and full disclosure, I did not read the entire thing. I read very carefully the introduction, the first chapter, which covers all the new psychologies, the chapter dedicated to Robert Musil, and then the conclusion. And I did that because I did not want to, in the midst of reading this great novel, I didn't want to fill my head with all of the criticism on Walter Pater, Rilke, Alice James, Henry James, Gertrude Stein, Franz Kafka, Schnitzler, James Joyce, Proust, and Woolf, and so on. However, I did glean enough from this to know that I'm definitely going to go back and read those sections, especially in tandem with some of these authors' works that I'll be revisiting. One thing that I'm really interested in is to read the sections on Gertrude Stein, because I actually have a video about Tender Buttons that I haven't launched yet. It's already edited, ready to go, but I talk about how I have a really contentious relationship with Gertrude Stein's works. They're very difficult for me to connect with. And I honestly do think that it's because I don't get her. I don't get Gertrude Stein, yet she gets me. She understands me while I don't understand her. And from what I've read in this is going to really help unlock what she's doing. And it does the same thing for Musil. And I wish I had read this earlier. Her stance, Judith Ryan, her stance is basically that, you know, when we think of the relation between psychology and literature, most of us think of Freudian psychology or one of its more recent modifications, such as that of Jacques Lacan. But James, William James, and Mach, Ernst Mach, are representatives of an earlier kind of psychology whose impact on 20th century writing was much greater than is generally realized. And for the first 2 and really 3 videos of the series, all that I read, I couldn't help but filter through my Freudian psychology. And I didn't have a grasp on William James, only that he was the brother of Henry James. And I definitely didn't have a grasp on Ernst Mach. And whenever the word empiricism would come up, I would immediately think 18th century British empiricism with George Berkeley and David Hume and John Locke. I've read all 3 of their major works, and the inquiry into human understanding comes in here, or into Musil explicitly, and he talks about, you know, inductive reasoning that Hume uses to show that, you know, we know the sun's going to come up because we've seen it come up to this point and so on. And what Ryan does a good job of pointing out is that these late 19th century psychologists were much closer to philosophers than the 20th century psychologies of Freud and Lacan. James and Mach want to get this philosophical precision, but unlike Locke and Hume and Berkeley, they're interested in consciousness, not an objective reality out there, but rooted in consciousness. Like how does this, what philosophers now call qualia, where is this in relation to the I and to the self and to the out there and the in here? Interestingly, Ryan points out, this is a big statement, to look in the works of these writers, meaning Musil, to delve into the psyches of their characters is to miss the point of this kind of literature entirely. More important to them, Musil, was the presentation of consciousness and sensory perception. She adopts a phrase from Musil, and she calls what he does daylight mysticism, and its practitioners, Bruce Wolf and Musil himself, they use it to create works that are truly the culmination of empiricist modernism. And so she harps again and again on the fact that really The Man Without Qualities is the largest, most direct attempt to engage with empiricist philosophies. So what about Ernst Mach? His point is that the self includes, or more precisely, is what it sees. And this is why she included his little drawing of Mach himself looking out into his study. And you get a little bit of the ridge of his eye and then some of his nose and his bushy mustache here. But what he's showing is that contra Cartesian dualism, the self includes what it sees. So the self is actually conflated in everything out there. It says again, the Austrian school of philosopher-psychologists believe no longer did I exist because I thought, so this is cogito ergo sum of the Cartesians, but I was the one who saw, and I was identical with what I saw. The self was no longer firmly anchored in the body, but in consciousness itself. And this was no longer a discrete unit, but included everything that was within the individual field of perception. So then we couple that with William James's pragmatism, his belief that the best views are those that have practical value for us. The pragmatistic position is that the self is a convenient, practical label which we attach to our ever changing sense perceptions. And so now we're down all the way where we realize that even the title, The Man Without Qualities, is, as Ryan says, a provocatively empiricist title. And in the book itself is one of the most carefully elaborated and theoretically advanced examples of literary empiricism. Musil, of all the modernists, was the most intimately acquainted with empiricist thought. He was a philosopher by training, and he also distinguished himself in the field of perception by the invention of the color wheel that is still used to demonstrate the optical mixing of colors. When Freudian psychology was well established, Musil rejected much of what it had to offer, and we'll see some of this here in a minute in the text. He did his dissertation towards an evaluation of Ernst Mach's theories. He really questioned how something that may be no more than an idea in our minds can have a palpable influence upon something else. And this is exactly what Musil was trying to work out in his great unfinished novel. One place that Mach takes this whole Cartesian dualism, the issue there, the discrepancy between how can something that's in thought or in this disconnected mind or consciousness have an actual palpable effect on the physical. Mach says that the problem is that posed by which is known as neutral monism, the belief held in particular by Ernst Mach that the mental and the physical are simply different aspects of the same stuff. As part of all of this, and like Ryan points out, the aesthetic, the writing itself, the formalism of it comes out of this empiricist investigation and culminates in what she calls the floating perspective. This is the shifting almost imperceptibly from third person to narrated monologue to interior monologue. It is the ideal technique for a writer who wants to present a problem without suggesting an answer, and it was a technique that was ultimately to become Musil's trademark. The Man Without Qualities is his greatest exploitation of the floating perspective. And this is so true. I noticed this from time to time, and I really didn't think much of it. It was something I noticed and didn't make mark of, which is why turning to these secondary sources is so important, because it brings an awareness to the novel. But I noticed these little shifts, how it felt like we were currently with the narrator, and then suddenly the narrator's telling us someone's thoughts, but they've been so objective and exterior for a while, and then all of a sudden they're in this character's perspective but not thoughts, and then boom, back to third person. Musil's caricature of a constantly shifting, essentially empty, patriotic enterprise amounts to an ironic identification of empiricism with Austria. So now Austria, or Caconia as he called it, becomes his symbol of empiricism. It says here, like Wolff's moments of being, Musil's daylight mysticism gives new meaning to a world whose dissolution had seemed to make all action futile and all thought vapid. His exploration of a mystic other state of consciousness is finally revealed to be a different way of looking at what was already before one's eyes. So now let's turn to the novel itself. There are these thematic clumps, as I call them, politics we get with Schmeisser, Lindner, and Hans Sepp, where Schmeisser represents sort of a left wing and Lindner is apolitical, and Hans Sepp is far right, tending towards fascism. We get power as represented by Ulrich, Clarissa, and Walter. We get justice in a sublime scene that we'll focus on in a minute with Freudenthal, Pfeiffer, Moosbrugger, and Clarissa. And we get genius with Stumm, Ulrich, Walter, Clarissa, and Meingast. From Musil's notes on the novel, he says, the novel does not describe this time, meaning, Vienna in 1913, the way it really was, but it describes the time as it is mirrored in a person outside the mainstream. So this is Ulrich, and it says, "This is the tragedy of a failed person, or more properly, the person who, in questions of emotion and understanding, is always aware of a further possibility." And that is exactly how Ulrich comes off. It's not that he's apathetic or lazy or disconnected completely. It's that he's just constantly, like, he's interested and wants to think about things and wants to meditate on ideas, but he's always aware of a further possibility. I see a strong link here to Harold Bloom, and I'll break this down a little bit, but he has this in his notes on the novel. He has this query: why is it that people today don't pay attention to ideas in art, while in other respects they demonstrate an absolutely ridiculous interest in doctrines? Without getting too specific and getting too thorny here, I do see a strong link to what Bloom was after, because ideas in art, I take this to mean the philosophical branch of aesthetics, and Bloom was very much an aesthete. He didn't care for any, so-called doctrines, and he wanted to focus on ideas in art, art for art's sake. And more decadence and aesthetics and so on, and he wanted to pay attention to just that, to a fault where he became a bully, to these other aspects, to the point of ridicule. But really, I guess we'll never know, because unlike Bloom, who took a very hard stance, Musil says, "My view of, or task I would set for literature: partial solution, contribution to the solution, investigation, or the like. I feel exempted from having to give an unequivocal response. I have, after all, also postulated the morality of individual cases," etc. Again, Ulrich is finally one who desires community while rejecting the given possibilities. He always sees a new possibility. And now, if I hadn't read Judith Ryan's quote about how, to miss what they were doing with the form and structure of the work, and instead trying to delve and see them as delving into the psyches, I wouldn't have noticed this. He says, "Today the structure of a work is more important than its course. One must learn to understand that side again, then one will have books." In my previous video, I talked about how difficult some of those chapters were on his Ulrich's notes that Agata finds in his desk drawers about the psychology of the emotions. But check this out. About the chapters on the psychology of the emotions, this is not psychology in its ultimate intention, but a description of the world. Having read that in his notes, and now Ryan's book, makes me actually want to go back and reread those sections that seemed so difficult to me before, because now I have a new lens with which to view it and glean more from it. Let's talk about some of the standout portions of this chunk of the Posthumous papers. Here we go. Here's some derision of Freudian psychoanalysis. "For when psychoanalysis, because an age that nowhere goes in for intellectual or spiritual depth, is riveted to hear that it has a depth psychology, began to become an everyday philosophy, and interrupted the middle class's lack of adventure, everything in sight was called libido. Only genius is bearable, and average people have to be squeezed to either produce it or allow it to prevail." Anyway, we've found that among Germans, if we don't see the strictly Kantian spirit of originality, we feel that eccentric and conspicuous behavior indicates genius. It is a distinctive mark of our age, of our time, that we have too many geniuses. So here's some of the text on the shortcomings of philosophical empiricism from 18th century British philosophers. "What was baptized as empiricism in philosophical language was a doctrine that arbitrarily declared the really astonishing presence and unchangeable sway of laws in nature and in the rules of the intellect to be a deceptive view that originated in habituation, to the frequent repetition of the same experiences. The approximate classical formula for this was, whatever repeats itself often enough seems to have to be so. And in this exaggerated form, which the 18th and 19th centuries bestowed upon it, this formula was a repercussion of the long antecedent theological speculation. That is of the faith placed in God, of being able to explain his works with the aid of whatever one takes into one's head. So here, that's a real jab at Hume right there. And even more explicitly down here where he says, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west for no other reason than that up till now it always has. So these are clues into these new dimensions of empiricist thought that Musil is breaking ground on in this novel. A couple more examples of Agatha's sharp assessments and cutting to the core of Ulrich. She says, you carefully dissect according to natural and moral laws the possibility of extending your hand. Why don't you simply reach out? What a situation to be in, Agatha's saying. Feeling that you're not a good person and yet not wanting it any other way. And then again, Agatha exclaims, oh, you've often talked about morality. You've set before me at least 10 different definitions. Every time listening to you was a totally new experience. On pages 1494 through 1497, we get these thoughts from Ulrich on the difference between living for and living in something. And I have gone and I have read these over and over. I wish that this wasn't unfinished. Unfortunately, he leaves off because I really want I think I understand his definition of living for. Human life appears to be just long enough so that in it, if one lives for something, one can accomplish the trajectory from neophyte to Nestor, meaning the Nestor, the aged general, I think he was, from Homer's Iliad. Patriarch or pioneer. And in doing so, it matters less for human satisfaction what one lives for than that one can live for something. But then he says, this is why it is simply to